Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Ridge Forrester could hardly catch his breath as he sat frozen in the cold, sterile hallway of the Los Angeles Police Department, the dim fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on his worn face. The walls felt suffocating, pressing in on him like the weight of an unbearable secret he hadn't yet fully grasped. He kept running his hands through his hair, the gesture frantic, almost animalistic, as though the motion alone could erase the chaos that had erupted in his life over the last 24 hours. Every instinct in his body screamed that something catastrophic had happened, something so dark and twisted that Ridge could not even put it into words. He could hear the distant murmur of officers moving behind closed doors, phones ringing intermittently, the shuffle of papers, the clatter of keyboards, and yet all of it seemed to exist in a different reality, far removed from the one in which his family had always thrived, the one where Forrester Creations stood as a symbol of legacy, pride, and unshakable stability. But that world, he realized with a sickening dread, had just been irrevocably shattered. It had started with a phone call that Ridge had thought he could dismiss as another misunderstanding, another twisted coincidence in the volatile lives of his children and the Forrester empire. But the voice on the other end, official, steady, chillingly calm, had delivered words that ripped through him like a jagged blade. "Mr. Forrester, we need you to come to the station. There's been an incident. We believe your son Thomas may be involved." Thomas. His Thomas. Ridge felt his chest tighten, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that was almost unbearable. He had known that Thomas had a temper, that he could be impulsive, manipulative even, but the idea that his son could be connected to something as unthinkable as murder was something he could not comprehend. Paris Buckingham. Her face flashed unbidden in his mind, laughing at some gala, walking through the Forrester courtyard, her light and warmth a stark contrast to the dark news he now faced. The mere thought of her lifeless body, the possibility that she might be gone forever, made Ridge gag on his own panic. He wanted to run to escape this nightmare, but his legs refused to obey. He felt trapped, ensnared in the grip of fear, helpless, as if the entire universe had conspired to bring him here, to this very moment of torment. When Ridge arrived at the station, the world seemed to move in slow motion. He could see Thomas sitting in an interrogation room just beyond the glass, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his normally poised and polished demeanor cracked by the tension that he tried so desperately to hide. There was a shadow beneath Thomas's eyes that Ridge had never seen before, a deepening darkness that mirrored the words he had just been told. And then the detective, a stern woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through the soul, approached him with a folder in her hands. The air around Ridge felt heavy, charged with a kind of ominous electricity, every fiber of his being screaming that nothing would ever be the same again. He wanted to ask questions, to demand explanations, but his voice was caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. The detective's gaze was unflinching, her mouth a thin, unreadable line, and Ridge felt the full weight of authority pressing down on him. "Mr. Forrester," she said, her voice steady, almost cruel in its precision, "we have reason to believe that your son, Thomas Forrester, was involved in the death of Paris Buckingham. We understand this is difficult, but we need your cooperation as this investigation moves forward." Those words landed on Ridge like a hammer. He stumbled backward slightly, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. The room tilted, and for a moment, he felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. What are you saying?" he croaked, his throat dry, his voice breaking under the pressure of fear and anger and disbelief all at once. The detective didn't flinch, didn't offer any reassurance. She simply handed him the folder, the manila envelope feeling impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. Inside, Ridge found photographs, witness statements, surveillance footage, timestamps, all documenting a series of events he had never imagined his son could be part of. Paris had been at a private event that evening, a gala that Ridge himself had not attended, a charity function full of the kind of glamorous, polished people who floated through life seemingly untouched by darkness. But by the end of the night, something had gone terribly wrong. The photos captured Thomas and Paris in an intense conversation, their expressions sharp and tense. Witness statements suggested a struggle, A heated argument that had escalated beyond anyone's control. And Ridge's heart sank further when the footage revealed that Thomas was the last person seen leaving Paris's vicinity before the incident. Every detail, every shred of evidence seemed to point to the unimaginable, that Thomas, his own son, could have been responsible for the death of someone as innocent, as full of life as Paris Buckingham. Ridge's hands shook violently as he flipped through the documents. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears, a deafening drum that drowned out every rational thought. He wanted to scream at someone, to demand that they tell him this couldn't be true, that there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding. But the faces in the photos, the cold, clinical tone of the reports, the unflinching logic of the detective standing before him, all of it left no room for denial. Ridge felt a chasm opening inside him, a void so deep and dark that he feared he would fall in and never return. And then, in a moment of clarity that was almost cruel in its precision, he realized what it meant for his family, for the Forrester legacy, for everything he had worked so hard to build. If Thomas had done this, if even a fraction of the allegations were true, the fallout would be catastrophic. Careers would be destroyed, trust irreparably broken, reputations shattered, and most painfully of all, the bond between father and son, already strained by years of conflict and rivalry, might be lost forever. Thomas's eyes met Ridge's through the glass, a silent plea, a mixture of fear, guilt, and something Ridge could not yet name. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, to tell his son that he would always love him, no matter what. But the weight of the evidence, the gravity of the police's words, made that connection almost impossible. Ridge felt himself breaking, his composure crumbling as he sank into the chair outside the interrogation room, the folder dropping onto his lap, papers scattering across the floor like fallen leaves in a storm. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs he could no longer contain. For the first time in years, Ridge felt utterly powerless, a man at the mercy of forces far beyond his control, facing the unimaginable reality that his son might have taken a life. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as Ridge sat there, the world around him fading into a blur of shadows and whispers. Friends, family, colleagues, everyone who had ever been part of his life felt impossibly distant, as though he had been transported into a void where only fear, guilt, and despair existed. And yet, even amidst the terror, a flicker of something stubborn, unyielding, and quintessentially Forrester remained, the desperate need to find the truth. Ridge's mind raced, piecing together every interaction he had ever witnessed between Thomas and Paris, every conversation he had overheard, every argument he had witnessed. Was it possible that he had missed something, that there was more to the story than the cold facts presented in the folder? Could there be some explanation, some twist that would absolve Thomas and restore even a fragment of the life that had just been ripped from him? The thought was fragile, almost painfully naive, but it was all Ridge had to cling to. And then the detective spoke again, her voice cutting through the fog in Ridge's mind. "Mr. Forrester, we understand this is difficult. We are still investigating, but based on our findings, Thomas is currently the prime suspect. We need him to remain available for questioning. Any attempt to influence him or interfere with the investigation could have serious consequences." The words hit Ridge like a thunderclap, leaving him gasping, shaking, broken. He wanted to argue, to insist that his son was innocent, that there must be some mistake. But the reality, as cruel and merciless as it was, offered no easy answers. Ridge felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, the unbearable knowledge that the life of his child, the life of Paris Buckingham, and the stability of his entire family now rested on the narrowest of threads. As he sat there, alone in the sterile hallway, Ridge's thoughts turned to Brooke, to Steffi, to Hope, to every member of his fractured but fiercely loyal family. How would they survive this? How could they possibly withstand the storm that was about to hit? The Forrester name, once synonymous with success, glamour, and unassailable influence, now teetered on the edge of ruin. Ridge thought of the countless years he had spent building an empire, mentoring his children, nurturing relationships, navigating betrayals and reconciliations, only to realize that all of it could be undone by a single horrific act. And through it all, the image of Paris, vibrant, intelligent, unassuming, haunted him, a ghost that would not allow him even a moment of peace. Ridge's breakdown was not dramatic in the way the world might expect. There were no shouted accusations, no violent gestures, no outward show of rage. Instead, it was internal, a slow and merciless unraveling of everything he had known to be true. He felt his mind fracture into 1,000 pieces, each one carrying a shard of fear, guilt, sorrow, and disbelief. He remembered conversations with Thomas, moments when he had offered guidance, counsel, and love, and now those memories felt like cruel reminders of the distance between them, the unbridgeable gap that a potential tragedy could create. Ridge knew that if the truth revealed Thomas's culpability, he would be forced to confront a reality more painful than anything he had ever endured. The realization that his own son could be capable of taking a life, that the consequences would ripple through every corner of their lives, leaving nothing untouched, no heart unscarred. Hours bled into one another, the fluorescent lights above flickering faintly, the air heavy with tension. Ridge felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening, no relief, only the slow, agonizing progression of events that had already been set in motion. Every sound, every movement, every glance from the officers walking past him reminded him of the fragility of life, the cruelty of circumstance, and the terrifying unpredictability of human behavior. He thought of Thomas once more, the son he loved fiercely despite every flaw and misstep, and he felt the sharp sting of helplessness. How could he protect him? How could he shield him from the consequences of actions that may or may not have been intentional? Ridge knew that in the coming days, weeks, and months, nothing would ever be the same. Every choice, every word, every glance within the family would carry the weight of suspicion, the shadow of tragedy, the potential for devastation. Yet even in this darkness, in the midst of this unimaginable grief and fear, Ridge's innate strength, honed over decades of navigating betrayal, business wars, and personal heartbreak, began to stir. The man who had once faced corporate takeovers, family betrayals, and the collapse of empires knew instinctively that he could not allow despair to consume him entirely. He would fight, he would uncover the truth, he would protect his family, even if it meant confronting the most terrifying possibility of all, that Thomas had crossed a line from which there was no return. Ridge straightened, his hands still trembling, his chest still tight, but his mind now sharpening with determination. He would face the investigation, he would confront his son, he would endure the pain and heartbreak that inevitably lay ahead. Because that was what it meant to be Ridge Forrester, to survive the storms, to protect the family, and to seek the truth, no matter how devastating that truth might be. And so, as the night stretched on and the city outside the police station carried on in oblivious normalcy, Ridge Forrester remained seated, caught between despair and resolve, his mind a tempest of fear, hope, and unrelenting determination. He had been handed a bombshell that threatened to destroy everything, a revelation that could crumble not just his family, but his very identity, yet within the ruins of his heart, a flicker of steadfast courage endured. The investigation would continue, the police would follow their procedures, and Ridge would do whatever it took to navigate the darkness that had enveloped his life. He knew that no matter the outcome, nothing would ever be the same, and yet somehow through the pain, the terror, and the heartbreak Ridge Forrester would endure, for the sake of Thomas, for the memory of Paris, and for the fragile hope that justice, truth, and family could survive even the most devastating bombshell of all. As Ridge sat slumped against the cold wall of the police station, barely aware of the world around him, the tension inside the interrogation room grew almost unbearable. Thomas Forrester, normally so composed and polished, was a storm of conflicting emotions, his body rigid, hands clenched, jaw tight. He had spent countless hours meticulously crafting his image in the world, the charming, ambitious son of Ridge and Brooke, the heir to the Forrester legacy, someone who could command a room with his presence, yet here he was stripped bare of pretense, facing a nightmare he never imagined possible. He had known Paris Buckingham, admired her intelligence and warmth, had even confided in her at times. And now the very name he had once spoken with affection had become the center of a police investigation that threatened to destroy his life. Every second stretched out, a slow-motion spiral of fear and dread, as he tried to piece together how a night that had begun so mundanely had escalated into this catastrophic point. The detective had left him alone in the interrogation room, a calculated move to let the weight of reality settle in before pressing further, and Thomas was acutely aware of the silence pressing against him from every side. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, cold metal, and an almost imperceptible odor of anxiety that seemed to cling to the walls themselves. He tried to steady his breathing to remind himself that he hadn't committed a crime, that the evidence must be circumstantial, that the police were just doing their job. Yet each thought felt fragile, like a castle made of sand being eroded by a relentless tide. He remembered Paris at the gala, her laughter echoing through the grand hall, her eyes bright and full of life, the easy way she had moved through the crowd, oblivious to the darkness that was about to descend. How could something so innocent, so light, have turned into this nightmare so suddenly? Meanwhile, Ridge's mind refused to stop spinning. Every scenario, every possibility, every past misstep in Thomas's upbringing now seemed to converge into one terrifying vision of potential guilt. He remembered Thomas's past temper, past manipulations, moments of selfishness, and now he wondered with a creeping horror whether these traits had culminated in something unthinkable. He felt the iron grip of helplessness tighten around him, suffocating him as he thought of Brooke. Brooke, who had always been the stabilizing force in their family, the one who had weathered every storm alongside him, who had fought tirelessly for their children and the Forrester legacy. How would she survive this revelation? Would she turn on Thomas? Would the very bond that had held the family together for decades snap under the weight of suspicion and fear? Ridge felt tears prick at his eyes, hot and unwelcome, as the full enormity of the situation settled over him like a shroud. Back in the interrogation room, Thomas finally allowed himself a long, shuddering breath, knowing that the walls were thin, that his father's pain was palpable, that Ridge's presence outside was both a comfort and a torment. He wanted to scream, to shout his innocence, to beg for understanding, yet he feared that words would never be enough to convey the truth in a world that already seemed determined to condemn him. He recalled the argument with Paris that night, brief and tense, a disagreement over something trivial now magnified in the minds of the witnesses and worse, the authorities. Thomas had left the event frustrated, yes, but at no point had he harmed Paris. And yet, as he replayed the images from the surveillance footage in his mind, he felt a sinking feeling, a creeping doubt seated by the detective's calm, precise words, that the world outside might never believe him, that Ridge's own love for him might be tested in ways he had never anticipated. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. Ridge was eventually joined by Brooke, whose arrival immediately shattered what little composure he had left. Brooke's eyes, wide and glistening, mirrored his own terror. Her hand found his instinctively, fingers trembling as they intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that had descended upon their family. "Ridge," she whispered, her voice breaking. What happened? What did they say?" Ridge shook his head, unable to find words that could adequately explain the nightmare. "It's Thomas," he managed, voice hoarse and cracked. They think he... Brooke, they think Thomas." The words faltered, stumbling over themselves as the weight of the accusation pressed down harder than Ridge had ever imagined. Brooke's hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching as the horrifying reality sank in. Paris. Thomas. The accusation. It all collided into a perfect storm of disbelief, fear, and heartbreak. Steffi arrived not long after, having been called by Brooke in a frantic moment of panic. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the tension erupted. Steffi's eyes narrowed, scanning the scene, taking in Ridge's slumped posture, Brooke's trembling hands, and the scattered documents that seemed to mock them with their cruel reality. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice strong but unsteady, the kind of voice that tried to mask terror with authority. Ridge barely managed a glance in her direction, feeling the crushing weight of expectation and the desperate need to shield her from the full horror of what he had just learned. "It's Thomas," he said again, repeating the words as though by saying them over and over, he could somehow absorb the shock himself. Steffi's face paled and she took a step back, as though the revelation were a physical force threatening to knock her off balance. Inside the interrogation room, Thomas could sense the arrival of Brooke and Steffi outside, their voices and presence filtering through the thin glass.